Hi, my name is Tiffany Hernandez, and I did my research project on disproportionality in Kentucky foster care system, and it was a secondary data analysis of African American children in Kentucky. Disproportionality in foster care system refers to the overrepresentation or the underrepresentation of a specific demographic groups within the child welfare system compared to their presence in the general population. In Kentucky, as in many states, this is an issue that often affects children of color and those from marginalized communities. Understanding the disparities is crucial for developing effective interventions and policies aimed at ensuring equitable treatment for all children in the system. Based on data from AFCARS and Annie E. Casey Foundation, while African American youth made up 14% of the population, they made up 23% of the foster care system. The purpose of this study is to analyze disproportionality in Kentucky's foster care system regarding African American youth and evaluate the short and long term outcomes of African American youth in foster care, focusing on permanency, which could be reunification or adoption. During my literature review, there were several cases that, in one case in particular, where African American youth were placed in foster care twice as likely. They were twice as likely to enter foster care compared to their Caucasian counterparts and spent an average of 9 months longer in out of home care. In another study, and other previous studies in the U.S. show that there were disparities within child welfare among African American youth at different decision making points within the involvement, such as high rates of reporting, substantiations, and placement in out of home care and length of stays. There are also risk factors to maltreatment that include, but are not limited to, poverty and parenting stress. Allen and Rico in 2020 state that Black children and families are more likely to experience these risk factors. For example, the African American population is also more likely to live in poverty than the Caucasian population, and the Black poverty rate was twice as high as the white poverty rate in 2018. Those who live in low socioeconomic homes are 5 times more likely to experience several forms of maltreatment. A secondary data analysis completed by Knott and Donovan in 2010 found that African American children are significantly more likely than non-African American children to be placed in foster care through the child welfare system. Additional research on length of time in care and services offered to African American children could be beneficial to assist with understanding the impact foster care has on the youth. But this study aims to fill the gaps by taking a more focused approach to understanding these specific outcome domains and identifying factors that either contribute to or mitigate challenges for African American children in foster care. By examining individual, familial, and systemic contributors to outcomes, this research can help build a clearer picture of both risk factors and protective factors. The findings can guide interventions, policies, and practices that promote resilience, stability, and improve long-term outcomes for African American children in the child welfare system. The methods I used was a secondary data analysis that was conducted using de-identified data, and it was collected by the Adoption Foster Care Analysis Reporting System, which is AFCARS. And I requested this data from the National Data Archive and on child abuse and neglect. The data is collected by AFCARS from reports sent by the state agencies in the United States. So a state agency will collect the data based on their systems, whatever systems they use within their state government for child welfare, and they report this data to AFCARS. They do annual reporting. That AFCARS data is then sent to the National Data Archive on child abuse and neglect, where it's stored. My operational definitions of variables was race, foster care placement, and duration, and foster care permanency. My sample design was focused on African American youth placed in foster care in the U.S., but will mainly focus on Kentucky. We'll look at the population of African American youth in the U.S. and Kentucky, and then compare them to the number in foster care for the U.S. and Kentucky. The data collected for the population will be secondary data, which is de-identified by the Children's Defense Fund. So my results found that white children, there was a total in the data set, they made up 69.2% of the data set, with 415,805 of those children being white, 183,409 of those children were Black or African American, and that made up 30.5% of the data set. And this is age based on birth to 17 years and 11 months of age. So the first table, this is the African American youth versus Caucasian youth in foster care in the U.S. So as you can see, 30.5% of children in foster care in the United States were Black or African American, while 69.2% were Caucasian. In this one, we're looking at Kentucky. The total amount of children in Kentucky that were African American were 2,410, while white children in foster care made a total of 11,438. That makes it 83.8% versus 17.7% for African American youth in foster care in Kentucky. But to find the disproportionality, we have to look at population and compare that to the percentage of those in foster care. So this is talking about the population within the U.S. So the African American population in the U.S., based on the Children's Defense Fund data, 10.1 million African American children represented 13.8 of the total population in the U.S. African American children in foster care in the U.S., based on this data, found that 30.3% of children in foster care are identified as Black or African American, with a total of 183,409 out of 606,187. So we're going to put these two together. I tried to do a visual so it was easier to see. So if we look at the one on the left, we're talking about Caucasian children versus African American children in foster care in Kentucky. As you can see, white children made up 83.8%, while 17.7% were African American. And we'll go to the right and we're looking at the population. So African American children made up 10.8% of the child population in Kentucky, while white children made up 89.2% of the population in Kentucky. So we see the disproportionality in how, and I will go back so you can see that again. We see that there is disproportionality because the percentage of children in foster care that are identified as African American is 17.7%, but they only make up 10.8% of the population as a whole. So there's where we find the disproportionality. Now I want to talk about their length of stays versus Caucasian children in foster care. So the total days in foster care, I did a correlation, and the racial representation in foster care showed a strong negative correlation between identifying as white and as African American, and it is mutually exclusive racial categories in the data set. The foster care duration shows that Black African American children show a weak positive correlation with longer stays in foster care, and with white children show a weak negative correlation with longer stays. The results show that the data suggests slight racial disparities in foster care durations, with Black children potentially experiencing longer stays than white children. And the implications of that is these patterns may highlight systemic issues warranting further investigation to equity in foster care policies and practices. So to discuss the slides in a little bit more in depth, we have the population distribution in Kentucky. African American children made up 10% of the Kentucky's child population, while white children made up 89.2% of the population. And then with African American children, they made up 17.7% of the foster care population, but only made up 10.8% of the population as a whole. While the population for white children was 89.2%. They only made up 83.8% of the foster care population. So the numbers, you have African American children who have a higher number of a higher percentage in foster care versus their population, where white children have a higher number of population versus the number of the percentage in foster care. The overrepresentation of African American children in foster care, while African American children constitute only 10.8% of the overall population in Kentucky, they made up 17.7% of the foster care population. This reflects a disproportionate representation, likely influenced by systemic inequities in the child welfare practices, socioeconomic factors, and racial biases. So the implications of social work practice and policy. The overrepresentation in foster care points to systemic issues of oppression of marginalized populations. Social workers should engage the marginalized community to identify solutions that will work to address the issues that drive oppression and create stressors and prevent people from thriving. The youth are overrepresented in foster care because our systems are designed to be punitive and inaccessible. The strengths and weaknesses of this study. This was more quantitative data versus qualitative. The strength that's a strength because it provides a precise numerical data on the population of African American and Caucasian children in Kentucky and the representation in foster care. And the findings directly relate to critical issues in the child welfare system, such as systemic inequities and racial disparities. The weaknesses of the study is it primary quantitative data and does not include any qualitative perspectives from affected families, children, or social workers. And it does not dive deeply into the causes of overrepresentation. So potential future research recommendations would include qualitative methods to capture and experiences of families and children involved in the foster care systems, expand the study to include other racial and ethnic groups, and conduct regional comparisons. This focused on Kentucky as a whole and not in certain regions. It would be neat to look into, there's 9 service regions within the state of Kentucky in the child welfare system. And there are only 3 metropolitan areas that have the higher rate of African American children in the population. Also investigate systemic factors such as socioeconomic conditions, racial biases in child welfare, and the impact of specific policies.